Welcome to the Minor Matters podcast, where we get real about what it means to believe, belong, and live freely. This is a conversation on freedom of religion or belief in Sri Lanka and beyond. Today, we have Dr. Shamara Vetimuni with us, and we will be diving into freedom of religion or belief and its intersection with history and the present. So for those of you who don't know who Dr. Shamara is, she is the Junior Research Fellow in History at the Queen's College in the University of Oxford. She's also currently teaching at the Queen's College and has been a visiting lecturer at the University of Colombo. Dr. Shamara is also the founder of Itihas, an organization that promotes history education reform in Sri Lanka, and she was also the lead researcher for Minor Matters' virtual museum on religious freedom. Speaking of which, you can check out the Sri Lanka's first virtual museum of religious freedom on our website, which is linked below, museumofreligiousfreedom.lk. It's a digital space that brings together stories, history, and lived experiences of belief in Sri Lanka. So we'll dive into the conversation now. So Dr. Shamara, before we get into the actual history of it, I'd love to hear what first sparked your interest in Sri Lanka's past, especially considering history surrounding ethno-religious conflicts. Was there a specific moment or an experience that drew you to this field?
So thank you for the introduction, Angela. It's lovely to be here with you, and thank you to Minor Matters for having me on this program. I suppose one of the key factors in my interest in pursuing this history, especially as a doctorate, was I was working at a think tank in Colombo called Verite Research, and I was working there on religious discrimination and violence, especially looking at also the role of the state in enabling or doing insufficient amounts to prevent such violence. And so I wanted to go into the history because there was a sense at that time that religious violence, religious conflict was something relatively new, almost a post-war phenomenon, which I knew from that study that we did at Verite was not the case. In fact, we went as far back as 1994. But there was actually a much longer history to be told, and some of it already exists in the scholarship on religious freedom in Sri Lanka, and I just wanted to build on that.
Okay. So when you look back at Sri Lanka's story through that lens, what do you see as the key turning points in our history that really shaped the way religious freedom has been understood?
There are obviously several turning points, several key points that we could talk about. Colonialism is obviously a huge and really long-lasting one. But I suppose even after we got independence, there were several issues that stand out in our post-independence history that either promoted or constrained the freedom of religion in this country. It has to do with constitutional reform. It has to do with major legal cases. It has to do with the Civil War and what happened during that period of 25 plus years. And of course, recently there have been some really promising judgments as well coming out of the Supreme Court. But yeah, if I had to pick a key turning point, I'd obviously focus on what I'm most familiar with, which would be colonialism.
Okay. So as someone who has researched a lot on colonial history in Sri Lanka, in what way would you say did the colonial period influence the way religious identities were formed and understood in Sri Lanka?
So there's no short answer to that, but if I was pressed to give one, I'd say, okay, let me focus on the British colonial period. After the British entered Sri Lanka, Ceylon as it was known at the time in 1796, they passed a series of proclamations, conventions, regulations that actually guaranteed a degree of religious freedom in Ceylon, which in a sense stood at a marked contrast to the Portuguese and Dutch who came before them, who are a lot less enabling of religious freedom. But at the same time, we saw an influx of missionaries who then clashed with local religious communities on the ground. There were conversions that took place, but admittedly not forced conversions in the way they were forced at, the tip of a sword, in a sense, under the Portuguese especially. And we saw the establishment of new institutions like schools that had a sort of religious bent to them. So, for example, we saw the first Buddhist school being established called the Buddhist English School, known today as Ananda College. We saw a whole host of schools opening up in Jaffna. And so there were these really positive developments that came out of it, and a lot of these schools still exist today. But it also came with shifting identities, as you mentioned, and that in itself came with brought about new challenges.
Okay. Would you say it's mainly like a story of division and hierarchy, or was there like, I mean, you did mention there were positive exchanges as well. In addition to that, would you say it was a division of like position and hierarchy?
Certainly, because whatever said and done, colonialism is a deeply unfair and unequal system. The colonial state was significantly more powerful than the local communities which it encountered, and therefore things like funding for schools, disproportionately went to organizations that were considered worthy of funding by the colonial state, which today's state, for example, perhaps is unlikely to agree with. But that said, there were also particular instances in which we saw religion, being used positively as well in terms of community formation. If I try to give you an example of where local communities, especially from different ethno-religious communities, came together to actually challenge the colonial state, I can think of two examples off the top of my head. So for one is the temperance movement, which was actually a campaign against alcohol, which the colonial state was seen as disproportionately benefiting from in terms of arak rents and licenses. It was a huge source of government revenue at the time. And it was really Buddhist and Christian leaders together who stood at the forefront of the temperance campaign. In another example, the Muslim community were temporarily prevented from wearing the fez cap, which was considered their national headgear in 1905. And though other communities didn't become actively involved in the protest that took place in response to the state's decision to ban the fez cap being worn in the Supreme Court, there were a lot of petitions of support saying that no, this is their religious right to be able to wear this particular headgear. So despite the fact that there was no open, overt participation in the protest, there was some degree of support, at least verbal and written support, which I think is also an important episode to recall.
Speaking of like the different identities that we have and like the different categories that we fall into, like, do you think the categories that we often take for granted, like today in the present, like being Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim or Christian, were like sharpened during this period? And like, if so, how?
Yeah, undoubtedly. These identities are not new, and they certainly weren't created by the colonial state. People have had a sense of their religious identity for centuries, well before the colonizer came in. But what the British did, and in a sense they inherited some of these technologies of rule, as Professor Neera Wickramasinghe refers to them, is that they brought these identities into sharp focus, and they used instruments like the census, like representative bodies like the Ceylon Legislative Council, to almost insist that people identify themselves as X, Y, or Z. So if I give you an example, in the past you might have asked someone, who are you? How do you identify? And they might have mentioned the village they come from, their caste. They might have mentioned their occupation. But by the late 19th century, people were being encouraged to no small degree, because of the privileges and the entitlements that were associated with these particular identities, to identify along, for example, ethnic lines or communal lines. So the Ceylon Legislative Council was established with communal representatives, and the three natives who, quote-unquote natives, who stood on the council between 1835 and 1889, at which point it was further expanded, were known as the Sinhalese representative, the Tamil representative, and the Burgher representative. So we can almost think about our current political inheritance and how political parties today remain fairly ethnicized or, established along religious lines. That history is deeply rooted in that 19th century experience of colonialism.
I'm also going to loop back to you mentioning the arrival of the missionaries in Sri Lanka. So their arrival was a big part of our identity in like colonial history and during the colonial period. So like, could you walk us through their arrival and the role that they played in reshaping religion and like cultural identities?
Okay, so we are talking about the British period, but it's important to remember that they weren't missionaries didn't enter the island for the first time under the British. They certainly had come with the Portuguese and the Dutch before them, which also explains the original spread or entrance of Catholicism to the island under the Portuguese and then Protestantism under the Dutch. So the wave of missionaries in the 19th century under the British must be seen as exactly that, yet another wave. Though they did arrive in significant increasing numbers. And that, again, is not unique to Ceylon at the time. Religious revival, as well as the spread of missionaries, was very much a facet of empire in the 19th century and the expansion of empire. So, to talk about the Ceylonese example, there were a whole host of missionaries, and not just British, European missionaries, even American missionaries. Now, those American missionaries, for example, were confined to the north of the island, north and east, especially in Jaffna, because the British weren't so comfortable with them being elsewhere in the island. A lot of these missionaries established schools, some of which exist today, and they established schools in English. So this was actually a very important reason for why a lot of students or a lot of parents chose to send their children to schools, because under British colonial rule, in order to gain higher employment, and that really meant jobs in the government service, you needed English. And to learn English, you had to go to a school that taught English, and those are very often those missionary schools. At the same time, a lot of parents did not want to send their children to school where they would be exposed to or be expected to convert to Christianity. And the response to that process was actually the establishment of non-Christian English language schools like Zahira College for Muslims, like Jaffna Hindu College for Hindus, and like, as I mentioned earlier, the Buddhist English School for Buddhists. Christian missionaries did bring with them a lot of new technology. Again, the Dutch were the first to bring in the printing press, but it really spread during the 19th century, and they established printing presses all across the countries where, for example, pamphlets were published, both promoting Christianity and decrying local religions. This was part of the conflict that was taking place between indigenous communities and missionaries. By the 1860s, what happened was local communities were starting to write back and fight back, as someone called Christopher Bailey observes, as a global phenomenon to do with the print revolution. And so, for example, we saw the birth of the religious press. The Catholic press, for example, there was a Sinhala paper known as Jnanatha Pradipaya. Buddhist papers like Sarasavi Sandarasa and Sinhala Bauddha were being published. The Hindu organ was published in Jaffna. We really also saw the birth of community religious papers. We had Malay community papers, Muslim papers like Islam Mitiran and Muslim Nesan. And these remain a very useful record of shifting identities at the local level that also offer both contesting and complementary views in terms of what we know from English language sources, all usefully preserved at the National Archives. So if anyone is interested in seeing and actually touching these newspapers and working with them, they're freely available at the National Archives, and I'd encourage you all to have a look at them.
Thank you for that, Dr. Shamara. Since you also played a central role in our museum, the Museum of Religious Freedom that's online, you also bring a both personal but also a scholarly lens to it as the lead researcher. So the museum, it does highlight some of the key moments and the tensions in Sri Lankan history and Sri Lanka's story of religious freedom. So growing up, we ourselves like encounter different narratives and like very particular narratives also, whether it's at home or like at school or within our own communities, and like that often shapes our own understanding of these histories, right? So how do those narratives compare with the way the museum presents these same incidents of religious freedom and conflict?
That's a very, very good question, Angela, because it's something that all of us are constantly dealing with, whether we're conscious of it or not, right? We are constantly exposed to differences of opinion, whether at school, whether at home, whether in the media, which we just can't escape from. I think what the virtual museum aims to do is to present these various narratives. For one, what we tried to do was show that actually there's no one correct version of history. There's no one truth, but actually these multiple narratives exist, and they often coexist and overlap with each other. And rather than trying to be didactic and say, this is what this is the real version of history, we're trying to say, we want to complicate that, and we want to show you how actually contested the terrain was, how complex it was, and leave the viewers with the freedom to actually make up their own minds. And we worked with someone called Dr. Vindhya Butpitia, who was really, really excellent in actually establishing the museum in such a way that you're not forcing a particular narrative down someone's throat, but you're leaving it up to the viewer to decide. But we're giving them the tools with which to make up their own mind.
Okay. So when we do look at today's religious landscapes, do you see like echoes of all the conflicts in like the way communities relate to one another? So like in terms of like contested or shared sacred sites and like the ongoing challenges that like ethnic minorities in particular face?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the contestation over sacred spaces in the North and the East, ongoing, really reaching ahead at some point around this time last year, in particular places in the North, were examples of, people competing to claim space as their own. We came here first. No, we came here first. And using various institutions like the Department of Archaeology to back up the claim that, a particular community got there first. These spaces have long been inhabited by multiple communities who at different times may have had more of a claim. And it's very difficult to arbitrarily draw to a point to a particular time in history and say, but they were there at this time, because, if you look a little further back, it might be someone else. There are plenty of multi-religious sites in Sri Lanka that we should be looking to for inspiration and for encouragement. Places like Kataragama, Adams Peak, they have these long and glorious histories of being spaces for intercommunal interaction of very diverse religious beliefs that actually really reflect the pluralistic nature of this island's history, but unfortunately at the same time, in the last decade or so, backed by state power, there are attempts for the majority community to lay claim once again. So there are reports that there are attempts at Sinhalizing or Buddhicizing Kataragama as a purely Buddhist site. And this just is not true to what experience shows. So again, I think these are aspects of the virtual museum which we try to highlight.
I know we've been talking a lot about tensions and conflicts like since we started the podcast, but like we also know Sri Lanka does have a rich history of coexistence cooperation, like just as you mentioned in the previous answer as well. So like, could you share some of like those moments that you think are significant and like what lessons they could hold for us today? And like, is there any particular story of like coexistence that you feel deserves a lot more attention?
So again, off the top of my head, I'm just going to try and give two examples. One is that recently there have been some very progressive judgments coming out of the Supreme Court that have affirmed individuals' right to religious freedom or belief, especially in cases where Now, I'm not a lawyer, and I would have to really be careful when I try and recall these judgments, whether it was in response to something that the ICCPR Act had been used against an individual who had put something on his Facebook profile. And I believe it was Justice Kodagoda who came out and affirmed the individual's right to his freedom of belief and his freedom of expression, actually. These are really, really important landmark judgments, actually. If we look back to the Aragalaya in 2022, where there were certain elements who tried to actually once again point out that, a particular community is behind the anti-government movement. Actually, the people pushed past that. They identified it, and they talked about the fact that for too long, politicians and the state have been exploiting our religious and ethnic cleavages in order for them to, stay in power and keep us apart. And I think there was almost a sense of realization, and I don't want to get too rosy-eyed about this and about how long-lasting those effects are, but there was some kind of acknowledgement that the public is being manipulated along religious and ethnic lines, and people weren't going to stand for it much longer. These are fleeting moments, of course, but worth recalling.
So as we wrap up, where do you think meaningful change can come from? Is it like at an institutional and a policy level, or like from within the society and the community itself, and like through everyday acts of peace and coexistence? Or is it like a combination of both, or like other factors maybe?
I think it's always going to be a combination of various factors in terms of, yes, the everyday and the society is so important, but without some, state policy pushing us in the right direction, things are unlikely to change or be sustainably changed. My kind of focus is on education and education policy, which I think drastically does need to change. We could talk about, for example, the history curricula, which historians, academics for decades have been pointing out is inadequate, to say the least, in terms of the fact that it doesn't actually deal productively with our post-independence history, and it could do so much more to tell a more inclusive narrative without, a one-dimensional majoritarian history. At the same time, I think language in education is really, really important. Right now, children are essentially segregated by their language, by the language they speak. As a result, you have Sinhalese kids never knowing a Tamil child growing up. You have Muslim children who never know, especially if you also have divisions along religion. So we still have religious schools. You'd have a Muslim child never really interacting with the Tamil children. And as a result, they're growing up as strangers. They may live relatively close to each other, but the space for interaction is limited. I think we need to desegregate our schools. We need to have children of different communities playing with each other, learning with each other, learning from each other. And until we make a really productive or meaningful change in that direction, I think it will be difficult to see lasting generational change.
That actually brings us to the end of our conversation. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Shamara. We dove into multiple different topics. We dove into colonialism and like religious conflict, and also like hope for the future. So like I believe like everything that we did speak about today is important in some aspect, and I hope people listening in would take something with them and go. So thank you so much for coming today. Thank you for tuning in to the Minor Matters podcast. I hope you take away something that resonated with you this episode. And until next time, let's keep the conversations going on freedom of religion or belief in Sri Lanka and beyond.